Concluding our series on facets of violence, paths to peace, is John Cooper. And he's here, actually in the building already. I think his pulse rate is dropping appropriately. John is the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in England and Scotland. The Fellowship of Reconciliation is a faith-shaped peace, justice and non-violence movement founded in 1914, not by you. No, I thought he was looking good. Since then, branches have grown up all around the world to form a global network. In John's time with the Fellowship, they have launched a podcast. Well, hasn't everyone? They have seen a growth in membership and have started exploring both intersectional perspectives on peace and the links between climate change, war and peace. He is a member of a local ecumenical project in Birmingham and has led the Charities and Networks group for Churches Together in England, Britain and Ireland from 2022 to 2024. Prior to working for the Fellowship, John has worked on questions of peace and justice in different church spaces and is always keen that people of faith are active in a vibrant civil society. He holds a BA in politics, international relations, third world and development studies, and is a Methodist local preacher in training. What took you so long? I sort of assumed you were, but welcome to the Fellowship. His talk tonight, The Fierce Urgency of Peace, seeks to answer the question, in an era of rising military spending, runaway climate change and increasing social unrest, is a focus on building peace what is needed to rebalance spending, tackle climate change and increase social cohesion. So come and hear why peace is urgently needed and what steps you may consider taking to be active from today. John, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here. My international travels did take me into Wales and back because there is a signal blockage somewhere between Cheltenham and Bristol. So if anyone else is meeting anyone off the train, that's the challenge. It's a real privilege to be in Bristol, but also in this particular church. I bring greetings from Annie Sharples, who is one of the trustees of the Fellowship and greatly challenges and enriches our work. And I had to catch myself when I saw Michael Etheridge's name on the lectern here. So I think it was when he was in training at Wesley's Chapel in London. I think that was where I got to know him incredibly well and then kept in contact ever since. So it was, just one of those moments where I feel like, well, this is where I'm meant to be tonight. Over the course of my time and my contribution, I'm going to outline some of the many challenges facing communities and the world, and hopefully remind us a bit about the power of faith-based communities to be agents of hope and challenge. But this is only just a small signpost. Let's begin the journey together, not in Bristol, but in December 2024, in Warsaw, in Poland. I have the privilege of attending a pan-European ecumenical meeting exploring the principles of a just peace for Ukraine. It was a challenging and interesting conference. We had come from all different parts of Europe, different Christian faith traditions. Most people were speaking their second or third language, but we were all united in a wish to see an end to that war in Ukraine. How that might come about was a hot topic of conversation. And I have to say, I was left feeling quite uncomfortable when some of the delegates in Ukraine stood up in their dog collars to repeatedly request more military or lethal aid from nations represented in the room. It made me uncomfortable because I don't think simply increasing the number of weapons in a place of warfare will lead to its conclusion. But it also made me uncomfortable because I wasn't sure that men, and on this occasion it was all men, of the cloth should really stand and advocate for increased numbers of weapons. Even in times of war, is that really the church's job, let alone in times of peace? What is the Christian message to be? It's tempting to therefore think you're in for a bit of a moral and ethical head scratcher tonight. So instead, I'm going to take you, as you will do later, to a small group I was in of about 5 different people, each from a different nation and a different spiritual tradition. We were sharing different perspectives. And one of the Ukrainian ministers, a pastor who split his time between the military and working for a major Bible distributor, just turned around and said, "The children have spent more time in bomb shelters than in the classroom in the last 3 years." What lasting impact and damage will it do to the children? What opportunities will they have forever missed? For them, these questions of war and peace are not a moral or spiritual question. They are a matter of life and death. And that is why peace is so fierce and so urgent. It's not a university debating topic. Humanity's addiction to warfare is killing people around the world every day. And it's up to us to begin to plot something different. Why have I been invited? That's a question I've asked myself quite a few times. But if we go on to the next slide, I'll show a bit of institutional background. The organization I work for is the Fellowship of Reconciliation, founded in 1914 when, among other things, a German Lutheran and British Quaker shook hands on the railway station at Cologne just as the last trains were leaving after war had begun and said, "We're one in Christ and we'll never be at war." The fellowship was birthed out of a conviction that as Europe somersaulted towards war, there was a different calling we were all being called to pursue. And it was a recognition that even as the guns of war was firing, that commitment to reconciliation, to crossing borders and resisting war was still there and still in place. Our work and witness was not going to be dimmed. It would be accelerated, supporting conscientious objectors of all shapes, shades, sizes, and perspectives through 2 world wars and national service. Getting involved as part of the faith element of the broader peace movement, working on anti-racism from the 1940s onwards in Cardiff, London in the 1980s, doing long-term social work, and many, many more. On the right, or is it the left? The gentleman with the moustache and the black and white picture is one of your own, Walter Ayres, a sometime MP, among others, for Bristol North, lifetime member of the Fellowship, who declared, "If I believed in the efficiency of slaughter to remedy evils, I would long ago have advocated the killing of those who year after year have been responsible for the sweated, the starved, the slummed. I know, however, in my heart of hearts, that slaughter being wrong is no remedy." His fierce, faith-shaped commitment to peace saw him realize he was called to be an MP. Those faces in blue, including Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a lifetime member of FOR USA, are part of the global story of the fellowship, and each one of those in blue has been a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Faith has challenged people to walk a different path. So I'm going to give us 3 brief biblical reflections as it's Lent. Each one may be familiar to you as part of our Easter or Lent story, but I think each one reminds us in different ways about our need to be active on our work for peace. So our first one. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you bow down and worship me." Jesus said, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left, angels came down and attended him. A synopsis of Jesus being tempted for 40 days, 40 nights. If we took a bird's eye view over the world at the moment, what might we see? We would see 1 in 8 of the world's population are currently exposed to conflict. 50 countries around the world are in situations where that conflict could be described as high or turbulent. The doomsday clock sits at 89 seconds to midnight, one of the closest stages it has ever been. And in February this year, Crisis Watch indicated Bosnia, Burundi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Guinea-Bissau, Israel-Palestine, Nicaragua, and Sudan are all deteriorating in their situation, becoming even less stable, even more violent. We live in an era of increased conflict. And while we may think of state-on-state conflict, the reality is for many, many years it has been conflicts within states and between paramilitary armed groups and either local communities, state actors, or others. It all gets a bit blurry, and just in case there are any lawyers here, I'll pause the end of that sentence. But, in a completely unrelated matter, if you looked, for example, at the story of Shell in Nigeria or multiple companies in Colombia, you might see where the blurred lines and the violence really hit hard. The last 3 years have, though, seen an acceleration and increase in state and state conflict, most notably when Russia crossed internationally recognized borders and restarted a long simmering conflict with Ukraine. This has radically changed Western political activity. Military spending has increased by 6.8%, this was in 2023, to $2.4 trillion around the world. And in just March this year, European nations alone found a further 800 billion euros to spend on the military. For those who think about things such as loss and damage and other climate change related payments, that's needing about $200 billion a year. But that can't be found, can it? And then there's hidden levels of conflict and violence. The increase in the far right and its hints of endorsing racial hatred and violence is a stain upon global politics. There's interference with elections, digital warfare, hacking, fake news, all sorts of ways to disrupt any state and sense of peace. And how do we respond? Well, since spring this year, it certainly feels like the old reliable toolkit of increased militarization and closed borders is being quite heavily pursued. Under this current government, we have seen what I would call the scandalous situation where the world's poor, supported through overseas aid, were in effect thrown under a bus when their funding was cut to increase military spending. And just bear in mind, once you've removed from the UK overseas aid budget the amount that's spent in this country supporting refugees, then the amount of aid going overseas is at one of its lowest levels of all time. Meanwhile, our own military budget, which is already the sixth biggest budget in the world, continues to grow. We'll be spending at least £100,000 a minute, meaning my talk, if I generally stick to time, is equivalent of about £2 million worth of military spending. All this I give you, said the devil, if you bow down and worship me. The promise and lure of military-based security and spending is immense. Big figures, often carried out in quite a few years' time, often in places that you can't immediately see. For many, it can feel like a good investment. But, Jesus then says he's challenged to worship the Lord and serve him only. And when do we meet God through Christ? when you love your neighbor as yourself. Can we ever truly love our neighbor if we are armed to the teeth, nervous, and removing the funding that helps build peace and security through properly supported nations all around the world? Let's go to another story. This coming Sunday is one of the most, if we go on to the next one. Sorry, I'd forgotten I hadn't got a clicker. My choice. This coming Sunday, I would say, is one of the most awkward ones in the Christian calendar. It's Palm Sunday, an annual reminder of the humility of Christ and the fickleness of humanity. Don't forget, we cheer him one week, then crucify him the next. This year's lectionary takes us teasingly close, almost within 2 lines, to a very important part. We have Jesus' entry into Jerusalem told through the Gospel of Luke, which apparently doesn't even mention palm leaves. So any ministers, if you've forgotten to order them, it's just a nice reason to demonstrate, have you also read your Bible passage clearly this year? Because I have, and that's why we haven't got them. But if you read another 2 verses after where the lectionary reading ends, then you see Jesus looking around him from the cult at all the cheering, all the celebration, all the hallelujahs. And he says, if you had only known on the day what would bring you peace, and now it's hidden from your eyes. A moment of great celebration when he could have been like, yep, I am going to take the applause. For once, my work is paid off. But he looks round and is like, oof, you haven't got a clue. And this was the man we welcome as the Prince of Peace on Christmas Day. Still going back to where is the peace? What are you doing? I think obviously that message of peace must be with a Christmas tree and other things in the loft. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a lifetime member of the Fellowship in the United States, railed against peace that stinks in the nostrils of God, which, beyond just being an incredibly graphic image, particularly if you happen to have a cold, was also for him, in his speech and sermon, a reminder that peace that is simply the absence of conflict is not true, lasting peace. For him, speaking just after a moment of protest and conflict on a local university campus had been ended, when the police arrived, charged, and dragged people out, not from a Quaker meeting house this time, but instead students off a university campus. And all the people at university went, hooray, peace is here! While all of those protested were being dragged away, beaten up, and ending up in jail. It was peace that stank because the reason the people were out protesting had not been dealt with, had not been talked about, had not been listened to, and so had not been resolved. It stank. The Ukraine war has now been going on for over 3 years. It's likely that nearly 750,000 people, primarily men, have either been killed or injured on the battlefield. Over 6 million people have been forced to flee their home and their country to seek safety and sanctuary elsewhere. If the fighting stopped tomorrow, we would all breathe a significant sigh of relief. We would be out, we would be cheering on the streets. Except would it be what makes for peace? Because peace would not return to that shattered nation unless there's proper social and psychological support to help people, primarily in Ukraine, that have been traumatized by what they have had to live through. You've got 1, if not 2 generations who have been forcibly conscripted, taught to kill, and then expected to return home without their weapons and pretend that life just went on in the everyday. You've got people who've done that, who then have to work out how to live with themselves after seeing all sorts of horrors in warfare. When going through Russian-occupied territory, seeing the end result of human rights abuses, no doubt in some battalions in the Ukraine army, also probably carrying out humanitarian rights abuses as well, because under the shadow of war, everyone commits crime and problems. So no peace unless that is truly dealt with. Peace will not truly return unless the underlying security concerns of Ukraine and Russia are dealt with. Mr. Trump's approach seems to be sort of neo-colonialist. A true peace builder brings people together because there's nothing in it for them except the solving of the conflict they see before them. Trump brings them all the time around the table, rolls up his sleeves and says, great, how am I going to financially benefit? Where is the peace in that? Let's be honest, as the UK, we know enough about colonialism to know it's not the way you build it. Peace will not return until Ukraine is able to physically rebuild. And that will kill the nation again, because the carbon cost of fighting and rebuilding is significant. Oxfam did some research earlier this year, and in January estimated the destruction in Gaza at that moment, if it was rebuilt, would take the annual carbon footprint of New Zealand. So far, probably so far recognizable. But peace will not return until people in Egypt, Ethiopia, and many other countries are fed. Whoa, has he turned the wrong page? No. Ukraine has long been a breadbasket nation that created more than enough for itself and fed and served many other nations. In the last century alone, it had been robbed by Stalin and undermined by the Soviet system. Yet, by the mid-2020s, before the conflict began, Russia and Ukraine between them accounted for 60% of the world's sunflower oil. So the global shutdown of trade with Russia and the impact of war being fought in Ukraine saw a huge shock. We saw some of it. Who can remember buying butter and other things for about £1 a pack? And suddenly it's £2, nearly £3 in different ways. Gas and other fossil fuels leaping up in prices. For the people of Zimbabwe, they saw their food go up 57% in price. Liberia, 61%, Angola, 13%. And in the streets of Nigeria, people were then out on protest about the cost of food. War in one place is leading to starvation and death in other places. And I touched on fossil fuels. Humanity's addiction to fossil fuels ties us into permanent conflict. Sourcing, securing, extracting, and burning fossil fuels are all tied up with conflict in different ways. The fighting of war is an incredibly polluting thing. If we go on to the next graph, for those who like to see, I'll keep going. The military is estimated to be about the 5th biggest carbon emitter in the world if all the world's military was counted. Yet, because the climate accords are a political agreement, shipping, military, and I think farming were left out. And of course, our addiction to fossil fuels, which needed a lot from Russia and other places, meant we've ended up in the stupid situation where particularly pensioners have been struggling to pay their fossil fuel bills. And the government says, can't pay that, difficult times. Let's save £2.2 billion a year. Oh, but we are going to write another open-ended cheque for £4 billion a year to underwrite weapon sales to Ukraine. Jesus looked around. Only they knew what made the peace. The third story Jesus has risen. Women have gathered. They go to see him. They find an empty tomb. Mary meets a gardener. Have you seen Jesus? And of course, it had to be the women who met Jesus first. Throughout history and the Gospels, it's those that society and power often throw aside that bring the good news for all. And if you wonder why is there a slight at the Gospels, just go and see how many times women are named, counted, and other things, and you soon realize there's a far bigger story that's often missed out. Peace is a vital aim in a world of increasing inequality and division. But we need to remember increasing inequality and division rarely causes discomfort to the powerful. It punches down and stigmatizes those who can't answer back. Either with things like the aid cuts because they're too far away, we'll never hear them, or because, as in this country, communities feel disenfranchised, not involved in political systems, so cut out. But the urgency of peace is also clear because it's often those who are not in control who make the most courageous moves to bring about peace. Conscientious objectors in Russia and Ukraine regularly send us at the Fellowship and others eye-watering reports of being beaten up, chastised, having their faith belittled, and generally being brutalized for daring to enact their human right, fought for in this country first and internationally recognized freedom of religion and thought, which lead them to say, I do not wish to partake in warfare. It led the women of Liberia many decades ago who were so fed up of war, they would go on a sex strike, and then they turn around, they surround a meeting hall where the men who are the politicians gather to debate. They pray, they sing, and they say, you're not coming out till you sort it. But you've not been sorting it quick enough, so get on with it. Because they know talking about a ceasefire doesn't bring the ceasefire. You need to get to that point of agreement. The urgency of peace is clear because war is killing the planet twice. Once with weapons of war, and second through the pollution and climate damage of fighting war and the pollutants thrown and sitting in the air as a result of fighting and rebuilding. So let's go on. We are in a year of many significant anniversaries. In a frighteningly few number of weeks, there's going to be 80 years since VE Day. You might hear 45 plus 80 is the other lingo. That's about 80 years since 1945. We'll quite likely hear lots of Vera Lynn's records being played. We'll quite likely see some very moving and powerful stories of those who lived through warfare. You might not hear debate over the ethics of mass bombing of Dresden, nuclear bombing of Nagasaki, or war crimes carried out by Allied troops. Instead, we'll be challenged with the idea of a noble sacrifice. No questions, no comments. But is that what the church is called to do at all times? It's the middle of the Second World War, and things have moved and changed, and the churches can see the Allies are going to win. Peace is going to return at some point soon. There will be more fighting. No prediction of nuclear weapons, but there will be more fighting. And so among some of the church leaders was a very different conversation beginning. Not how do we lament the presence of war, which churches are very good at doing, but when peace happens, what will it look like? How will we shape it? And ministering at that point in a nation which had been through 2 horrendous world wars in less than 50 years, how will we engage in this country and around the world in ways that mean war will never happen again? This was about 1941-42. Things were still pretty dicey, but the churches were daring to talk about peace. And that is what began to lead to the welfare state in its sort of current shape. Don't go into that too much. We won't have too long for questions. International relations and conversations led to the founding of the United Nations, which had its first meeting at Westminster Central Hall in London, which saw the UN International Human Rights Act emerge as a response to the absurd horror of the Holocaust, which has a lot of Judeo-Christian language deep within it. It also saw things such as UNESCO formed, which recognized the importance of culture and preserving and keeping alive cultures, particularly if they're in places of oppression and challenge. And you only need to pick up the books and read some of the initial stories in particular of anywhere that has been colonized or oppressed, and you discover one of the first things that's broken are local cultural expressions. But if you like stories of non-violence resistance, one of the first things Russian occupiers now do is confiscate all the yellow and blue paint whenever they go and occupy another bit of Ukraine. Because simply daubing that on the wall was one of the first non-violent acts of resistance to show the culture and the community is still there no matter whose weapons are in front of them. The other fun one was printing counterfeit money with messages of Ukrainian hope and resilience. These are what the church should be doing. I'm often asked at the end of talks like this where I find hope, particularly as I haven't necessarily sprinkled in the talk too much hope. So I'll answer that one now. I think of the need of peace as fierce and urgent, but I'm not always that hopeful. Why? Because for many of us, we often forget the core reason why peace matters. Let's think about one of the most amazing moments within the Easter story, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, as an ecumenical gathering, I will then say whether you think it's hypothetical, real, inexplicable, doesn't matter. Jesus died under one of the most brutal states in existence. He'd already told his supporters, don't fight back. But then what happens? He rises again. And we come out with phrases, love has won. Death has not got the final message. Dare we as the church do the same in the world when we pick up our newspapers and see so much death and destruction? Dare we invest our time and energy in building ways big or small to declare that weapons of death do not have the final say in how we build a more peaceful and just world? I'm not sure, but I know the small seeds of hope are there. I don't know what the story is in your church or community that you're part of, but it's interesting some of the research that's come out from the Bible Society over the past week, which shows that 18 to 35-year-olds are looking for community. They're looking to take social action. They're looking to explore the Bible more. And they're interested in faith. It's interesting. Why could that be? Within the fellowship, for the last year and a half, we've had someone joining every week. I can comfortably say in is outstripping leavers, even including those who are dying, which is not something you can say when you've been around since 1914. There is interest in conferences, education work, campaigns, not just in lamenting the presence of war, but trying to find for each of us our own shaped way of building peace instead. I'm going to conclude with a quote, hopefully will be up next, from the author of a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which listened in particular to Native Americans and their very spiritual connection to earth, land, sea, and people. This isn't from the book, but for me, it's about the invitation of church when it talks about peace. We hear so much about hope. Hope for what? For me, it's about helping people fall in love with the world again. I walked out of Bristol Templemead railway station, having come here via Wales unexpectedly. I didn't get a Welsh cake or anything like that. Having come from Birmingham, one of the most landlocked cities in the UK, the sun was streaming. Seagulls were making, at this point, a cheery noise. They weren't stealing any dinners. And it was good. People were greeting each other warmly, pleased to see each other after difficult or fun journeys. New adventures were beginning. That's the invitation of peace. A warm embrace, food when you need it, security for all, built upon love, relationship, and friendship. So that's why I think there's a fierce urgency for peace, because we need to fall in love with the world again. And if we're armed to the teeth, we're looking the wrong way. Thank you. I'll take a few at a time.
Okay. Yeah, John's getting himself some water. Yes, he's up for taking questions, but we'll have 1, 2, maybe 3 at a time. So if you've got a question, that's what he says.
I was asked, I answered. I'm blaming you, Ken. Okay. You two can sort it out later.
Okay. Okay. Do we have any questions?
Part of the long-term history that we've all lived in our own time and for generations past has been conflict between the churches and faiths. How can we reconcile, and I say this as a one-time denominational ecumenical person, so I am into the scene, don't worry. How can we persuade the Catholics and the Protestants, the Shias and the Sunnis, and all the other vicious differences to somehow realize their responsibility? And I'm so glad you put that word hope in as at the end.
Do we have another question?
Or comment if you want to just stand up and say, what a load of rubbish. But I'll still pay you a tenner because I want more talks next year.
Thank you so much. This is I guess it's a slight provocation.
Excellent.
In that, for example, in the creative world, an awful lot of very powerful creative impulses and therefore outputs happen at time of conflict because it is a site of resistance to conflict. And there were some interesting debates in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Oh no, what's going to happen to our cultural output because we've got nothing to rail against. So just some thoughts on that possibly.
Yes, history was never my strong point. And I remember a great feeling of hope. It was when Tito was in Yugoslavia, and then he died, and all hell seemed to be let loose with Bosnia, Serbia, and that seemed to be the really beginning of a slide. I don't know what you can say about that, but, you know, when Tito was there, okay, he was autocratic, and that was my feeling of hope then.
Excellent.
Take those
We've
three
got some good easy ones, so we'll take them. We'll take them in order. Ecumenism is going through an intriguing time at the moment, let alone interfaith work. So I've had the privilege of speaking at the Churches Together in England Forum, which brings together all the ecumenical officers, regional reps, and all the rest, and delivering them a challenge similar to tonight on the need for peace. What I've observed in the 4 or so years I've been involved in that space, but having grown up in the church for the last 20 odd years, is we're shifting from ecumenism by delicate bits of paper over which dot, T, comma, and question mark gets argued over by very intelligent and helpful people, to one where we realize actually there's a strength in our diversity. So the fact there are multiple churches is not necessarily an affront to Jesus's wish for us all to be one. The affront happens when we can't then all get in the same room, recognize there are starving people on the street, and all work together on the food bank, recognizing there may be other reasons we disagree, but on this we can see the need, we recognize God, and we're going to do something. And at the moment, it feels like nationally in both CTBI, so UK-wide, and also within Churches Together in England, the energy is around finding those points of common action to demonstrate a form of unity, partly because the ecumenical scene has grown as well. It's not just the Catholic and the Protestant groups getting together, it's also Pentecostal and in many ways, excitingly, the Orthodox Church as well. I say excitingly because Orthodox perspectives on things really often helps turn the tables in a very helpful way, just like Jesus did, on what our understanding and relationship is between us and Creator. And if you look more broadly at interfaith, you'll often find that similarly people find ways and means to get together and aren't doing it for the sake of everyone agreeing. However, there is a major problem, which is our cultural lack of religious knowledge. So I know when I grew up at school 25 odd years ago, I was playing football. Which football team do you support, they say to me in Edinburgh? Not sure. Well, are you Protestant or Catholic? Oh, okay. Well, that taught me something about ecumenism. What I learnt about interfaith stuff was more what I would call I Spy, going around a religious building. So I could recognize a Buddhist prayer wheel, but I couldn't necessarily tell you what they truly believed, let alone create spaces for encounter where we could listen and learn well. And as the religious map of the UK evolves, I say this living in Birmingham, where it's great my son gets to go to an iftar once a year and celebrate with Muslim friends in his school, that actually it's just as with ecumenical work, it's creating points of encounter where we don't have to agree, but recognize there's value in what we each bring. I hope that gives you some encouragement, but also you can understand where I come from. So if you want to disagree later, please do. Your question about the creative world is really, really interesting. But I would have to say I'd far rather not have had a Spanish Civil War than to have had the amazing Guernica painting of Picasso. I mean, I've seen it. It was in the East London Gallery in London for about 3 months. It is probably as wide as that gallery behind, possibly as tall as the glass doors. You cannot ignore it. But it came out of pain. And as you were talking, I was like, yes, we should always encourage creativity, the arts. I love the arts. I mean, I can't come to Bristol and say I don't like the arts. But it's like turning up and saying I don't like plasticine. I'll get run out of town. But I think we should be encouraging it in good times and nurturing it in challenging times, but also recognizing, particularly in the terms of helping post-conflict rebuilding and help, that there are two major things that help communities do that. One is having points of memory. So I had the privilege of meeting some peacemakers from Colombia last year, and they were talking about a community memory corner, in effect. And I was like, isn't it a bit odd that you live in this little community in the forest, trying to keep alive peace, but in the corner you've got a reminder of all the people who've been killed? Like, no, because we know who has been killed in pursuit of what we're seeking, it helps us keep their story alive, but also helps us keep energized. So particularly looking at churches and things, how do we use our spaces, our creative spaces, to create those points of memory, but also looking at psychological support in particular. For example, we've supported work in Palestine before, drawing classes, but also comedy classes for people living in immense oppression and challenge, to help people process what they're going through. So yeah, I'm not going to fully agree, but we should include the creative arts at all moments. And then a quick digest on Eastern European politics. We'll need to take some more questions, but what I will point our attention to is no one believed the Soviet Union was going to collapse, particularly the poor people who went up to the Russian Space Center as it actually did officially end, and were the only people stateless in the world at the time, and they had to negotiate to get them down. But one of the key ways the autocratic Soviet state was undermined was non-violent action. From the Monday night prayers in Eastern Germany, which are brilliant, but I won't go into full detail about them now, to the singing revolution of Estonia, where people lined the streets, held hands, and sang. People coming together destabilize the credibility that autocratic regimes assume they have through violence, fear, and intimidation. And going back to the Monday night prayers, there's an absolutely fascinating interview with the German pastor who was like, I wasn't there to bring the state down, but we needed a spiritual space to share what life was like at the time. But when they'd got to the stage of sort of tens of thousands of people marching up to the church, not only could they easily identify who the Stasi, the East German secret police agents were, because when they got in the church, they're the ones who had no idea what to do, while at least everyone else half nodded, bowed, stood up and sat down at the right time. The secret police didn't know what to do with thousands of people with prayers and candles. The pastor says they were ready for sticks and fight, not for prayers and candles. So the history of Eastern Europe is difficult. It's dangerous. It has lots of stories, counter-stories, undermining who's in which bit, but it's also got an amazing thread of non-violent resistance to oppression, which is always worth remembering.
Any questions about his answers to the questions? We could get very postmodern.
Or any other questions. This is my favourite bit.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. I agree instinctively with so much of it. So this is a genuine dilemma. It's not You took us to Ukraine several times over. You talked about, in another context, about peace that stinks. In Ukraine, a peace that stinks would be Putin takes over Ukraine. We know what the occupation was like for the brief time that it covered much of Ukraine, and as it continues in the occupied territories now. I share your shock at the Ukrainian pastors saying, what we need are guns, soldiers, and so on. But what do you expect them to say?
I'm just going to answer that one straight on. So I think the first thing to remember is that people living in Ukraine at the moment are in the middle of a trauma. And so we need to hear what they say carefully, but also recognize our place in what they say is slightly different. Now, our hands are not fully clean. We are sending billions of pounds worth of weapons into that war. We are enabling it to continue through the provision of weapons of war. And if I saw the same amount of energy, time put into trying to force a pause to the conflict so politicians can solve it, I might be a bit more optimistic. Never forget, an apple will fall down from a tree whether Mr. Newton sits under it or not. A bomb doesn't naturally occur. It doesn't naturally fly through the air. It doesn't naturally decide where it hits. That people are involved for every stage. So for me, it's about saying the church's role is to be a pastor among its people, even in horrific times, to pray, to lament. I still am uncomfortable with them saying, please send us more weapons, but I'm never going to say to them, you can't say that. But I'm going to say, as a nation that's a third party in that, our role shouldn't simply be to fuel the ongoing presence of war, because it's gone on for 3 years. We need it to end, and humans are the ones who end it, so we need to be pushing for that.
Okay, I think we'll probably wrap it up there.
No, hang on.
Sorry,
Let's prevent conflicts in the home. Pearl, you've got a question. Here we go. You want a load of rubbish? Here we go.
I just want to raise Gaza and Israel-Palestine. Well, it's the whole region, really, isn't it? Because there's Lebanon and Jordan and all the rest. I mean, I can feel that it's intractable. What do you think?
I was so hoping for more conversation before you got to your question. So I think there's a few different things. I'm on my phone, not to get my crib sheet, but from the 4th to the 16th of May, we are going to have an inspiring Palestinian called Zugbi Zugbi coming to the UK, who has been a reconciler in Bethlehem for at least the last 30 years, running Christian and interfaith points of dialogue, conversation, and listening. And he is going to be in Bath the evening of the 9th of May. Bath, the evening of the 9th of May. If you go onto our website, there's a sign-up form at the back. You'll be able to see precisely where it's fairly central, but I would heavily recommend you go and hear him. I think the second is to recognize that the use, abuse, and disregard of globally recognized human rights is in many ways at the heart of so much of what's wrong. And so to advocate for the upholding of internationally recognized human rights. So, for example, the increase in settler-based violence in particular at the moment under the cover of the conflict in Gaza is one you should be contacting your MP about, regardless of where you feel you sit in that conversation, because the world has recognized the settlers are a global provocation and shouldn't be there, and there had been political agreements that they should not be there. I think, though, the other element is to recognize that the current government of Israel is not one that would naturally look towards a peaceful solution. So as with the war in Ukraine, it's up for the rest of us to be forcing those difficult conversations to happen, to be raising a global noise to say, enough. Peace is needed, and peace through war and violence is not going to solve it. And if you want to break your heart, simply spend some time listening, in particular, to stories from an organization called Breaking the Silence. It's one of the most powerful groups I've ever heard of. So in Israel, as with some other countries, there is forms of conscription. Now, if you don't know what that means, that's where the law says when you hit a certain age, you're required to learn how to be in the army, and if we're active at the time, you go and fight and do whatever or wherever the state tells you. In this country, we don't have that. We have what's called a volunteer army, where you choose to do that. Another time we can discuss quite how fair the choosing is, and the way it mainly focuses on the poorest communities in the UK, and the fact we're one of only 2 nations in the world that recruits children, 16-year-olds. In Israel, they'll take 18-year-olds, and the stories they share of what they have been through is horrific. And fundamentally, it comes down to you give an 18-year-old a gun, you tell them how to shoot with it, then you put them in a situation, you tell them where everyone hates you. That's not how you're going to solve the situation. So take time to sit and listen with all sorts of groups, but advocate for peace and solving it, because fueling it with more weapons of war ain't going to be the answer. And there's enough voices from all round saying that you can be comfortable in that. Oh, yes. No, go for it.
It's something that I don't really have the courage to ask, but I'm going to because I've just suddenly thought about it. We were lucky enough to go to Palestine, so when the war broke out, the resonance was huge because we'd met such wonderful people there, such nice people. We did a tour of the Holy Land, West Bank, of course. One of the things that I find really difficult, and I wonder whether you've got any access to, is this bloody Bible we read with this God saying, carving up real estate and saying, this is your land and I'll smite all your enemies and I'll sort it out for you and it's yours. Because that's what these poor settlers, who are miserable people from America, who have no genetic or historic right to be there, but it's a cheap way of finding somewhere delightful to live with lots of sunshine and lots of land. And they believe that they have the right to do it. And what do we do? How do I reconcile myself with my own Bible, really?
Definitely one for far greater minds than mine. Partly because you've already had Helen Painter come and talk, and she does a great amount of work on particularly far-right use and abuse of the Bible. And I think there's an element within your question of actually spend time listening to those who've read the Bible from that angle and say, here's what we think, and here's now why I might think something slightly different.
Okay, so John, thank you so very much for that deeply thought-provoking talk. Can we show our appreciation in the usual way?